The conference room on the 42nd floor of the Langford building had a view of Lake Michigan that could make a man feel small before anyone even opened their mouth. Aaron Weston had known that walking in. He'd told himself it wouldn't matter. He'd been wrong. 6 members of the Langford family sat along one side of the table like a panel assembled to deliver a verdict they'd already agreed upon. Douglas Langford anchored the center, 73 years old, silver-haired, with the particular stillness of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to make someone afraid. To his left, his daughter Helena watched Aaron with the kind of focused attention that felt less like interest and more like inventory. The others, cousins, a nephew, one spouse who had married into the name, completed the tableau. A legal team sat behind them, laptops open, expressions neutral. And in the center of the table, a contract, 116 pages, bound in black, slid toward Aaron 20 minutes into the meeting by an attorney who didn't bother to make eye contact. $1.2 billion, the attorney said, as though reading a grocery list, contingent on full transfer of operational authority effective 90 days post-close. Aaron picked up the document. He'd built Veripath from a garage workspace in Evanston, 3 years after leaving the Army with a logistics officer's mind, a severance check, and a conviction that the system for connecting small veteran-owned suppliers to federal contracts was broken beyond what anyone had bothered to fix. He'd coded the original algorithm himself, while his daughter Clara slept in the next room, while the medical bills from his wife's accident sat in a stack he couldn't look at without his hands going cold. He turned to page 47. Then he turned to page 62. Then he understood. They weren't acquiring Veripath. They were acquiring the name, the client list, and the infrastructure, and relocating Aaron Weston to a title so ceremonial it might as well have been printed on air. He set the document down. He looked up. Douglas Langford hadn't moved. He tilted his head slightly, something between a smile and an appraisal settling on his face. "You've accomplished something real, Mr. Weston," he said. His voice was even, almost warm, the kind of warmth that knew exactly what it was doing. Most men who come from where you come from, military background, no industry connections, no inherited capital, they don't build anything that lasts. You built something functional. That's genuinely rare. He paused, letting the next part land with precision. But functional isn't the same as scalable. And the truth is, men in your position tend to overestimate how much of their company's value is the company, and how much is simply their moment. Moments pass, Mr. Weston. The question is whether you're smart enough to sell before yours does. No one laughed. That was almost worse. The room simply absorbed it. The cousins, the nephew, the spouse, accepting his words the way rooms accept gravity. Helena Langford didn't smile. She just watched, taking notes on something that wasn't written down anywhere. Aaron felt the sentence land exactly where it was aimed, in the place where the doubt already lived, the place that had been accumulating for months. The late nights wondering if the growth was real or borrowed. The mornings when the gap between what Veripath was and what it still needed to be felt like a distance he couldn't cross alone. His right hand moved without thinking, not toward the contract, toward his jacket pocket. He stopped himself before he reached it, but his fingers already knew what was there. A folded piece of paper, soft at the creases from being opened and closed too many times. Clara had drawn it 8 months ago, the week he'd signed Veripath's first major federal contract. She'd handed it to him at breakfast with the gravity only 8-year-olds could summon, her expression deeply serious, as though the moment required ceremony. A house with a flag on the roof, 2 stick figures in front of it, and in her careful, uneven letters across the top. Dad's company. He builds it for us. He'd put it in his pocket that morning and hadn't taken it out since. He looked at Douglas Langford, and something inside him settled. Not loudly, not in any way the room would have noticed. But something that had been listing sideways for the last hour went upright and stayed there. "I appreciate your assessment," Aaron said. His voice was level. "But I think we're looking at different documents." He placed both hands flat on the table and slid the contract back toward the center. "That one asks me to hand over everything that made this worth building. So my answer is no." For a moment, nothing moved in the room. Then Helena's chin lifted, almost imperceptibly, and Douglas Langford leaned back in his chair, studying Aaron with an expression that had shifted. Not angry, not surprised exactly, but recalibrated, like a man updating a calculation he'd assumed was already settled. Aaron didn't wait for a response. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out. The elevator ride down took 90 seconds. He counted them. Outside on Michigan Avenue, the October wind came off the lake hard enough to sting. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting it. The city didn't care what had just happened. Taxis moved, a food cart steamed. Two women in scrubs walked past arguing about something that had nothing to do with billion-dollar contracts or what it meant to refuse one. His phone buzzed, a reminder Clara had soccer practice at 5:30. He was expected to be there. He started walking. The fallout started before he reached his car. By the time Aaron got back to Veripath's office in the West Loop, a converted floor above a print shop that smelled like ink and old wood in a way he'd never gotten around to hating. Three of his senior team were already in the small conference room, waiting. Priscilla Odom, his COO, spoke first. She was 41, careful with words, not given to alarm, which made the controlled tension in her voice harder to ignore. "Tell me the Langford thing is still in play," she said. Aaron set his bag down. "It's not." The silence that followed was different from the one in the Langford boardroom. That one had been constructed deliberate. This one was just pain. Kevin Ruiz, head of engineering, leaned back in his chair and pressed both hands over his face before pulling them down. "Aaron, do you understand what that capital would have done for us? 18 months of runway. We could have doubled the team, expanded the compliance module, gone after state-level contracts." "I read the terms," Aaron said. "We all read the terms," Priscilla said, and her voice was quieter now. "We also read the alternative, which is a burn rate that starts getting uncomfortable in about 4 months. Aaron pulled out a chair and sat. He looked at each of them. Kevin, who'd left a comfortable position at a logistics firm to build something he believed in. Priscilla, who'd taken a 40% pay cut when she came on. Nadia, their head of client partnerships, who hadn't spoken yet and was looking at the table with the stillness of someone absorbing something she didn't want to absorb. They weren't buying the company, Aaron said. They were buying the name. My name, the contracts, the client relationships, and then they were going to run it the way they run everything else they've acquired. Which works fine for them. But it's not what any of us signed on to build. "It's 1.2 billion, Kevin said quietly. Not angry anymore, just honest. That's real, Aaron. That changes things for everyone in this room." "It changes who gets to decide what we become," Aaron said. "That's the part I couldn't sign." Priscilla looked at him for a long moment. "So what is the plan?" He hadn't told them about Meridian. He'd kept it separate, deliberately, carefully, in a subsidiary entity he'd structured 18 months ago for reasons he couldn't fully articulate at the time, except that something in his gut said, not yet. Meridian was a predictive compliance engine, a second-generation system that did something Veripath's core platform didn't. It didn't just optimize the bid process for veteran suppliers. It analyzed patterns in federal procurement data and flagged structural irregularities. The kind that cost taxpayers money and kept small businesses locked out of contracts they should have won. 2 months ago, quietly, a senior staffer in the Senate Armed Services Committee had asked Aaron for a private briefing. He'd given it. He'd been asked for a follow-up. He hadn't told his own board. "Give me 72 hours, he said. Priscilla studied him. She was the kind of person who needed forecast, documentation, mapped risk. But she also knew Aaron well enough to have learned, slowly, that his instincts were not random. 72 hours, she said finally, and then we have a real conversation." Kevin nodded reluctantly. Nadia looked up from the table for the first time. "What do you need from us in the meantime?" "Keep everything running," Aaron said. "Don't react to anything. Don't engage with any Langford communications without looping me in first." He didn't explain why. He didn't have to. Because when he checked his phone in the elevator, 3 emails had already arrived. One from a vendor citing a sudden review period on a pending agreement. One from a smaller partner expressing vague uncertainty about timing. One that was just a forwarded article, a piece speculating about Veripath's financial position, sourced anonymously, published in an industry newsletter that had never once covered them before today. The Langfords hadn't waited. He made it to soccer practice with 4 minutes to spare. Clara was already on the field in her blue jersey, chasing the ball with the cheerful chaos of a kid who was still working out which direction to run at any given moment. She spotted him over the fence before he'd even found a place to stand, and the grin she sent his way, wide, missing one incisor, entirely uncomplicated by anything happening in the world of federal procurement, was the first thing all day that felt like solid ground. He watched from the sideline with his coffee going cold in his hand, and for 45 minutes he did not check his phone once. On the drive home, she delivered a comprehensive analysis of why her best friend was wrong about whether unicorns could theoretically survive in Alaska. And he listened, and he asked follow-up questions, and he kept his voice easy when she glanced over and said, "You look tired again, Dad." "Long day," he said. "Was your meeting bad?" He thought about how to answer that. It was complicated, he said. She considered this with the seriousness she applied to most things. Mrs. Paulson says complicated usually means you already know the answer, but it's just hard to say. He didn't respond to that, but he thought about it for the rest of the drive. Later, after dinner, after Clara was in bed, and the apartment had gone quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the street noise bleeding through the cracked window, Aaron sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and the files he'd kept off Veripath's main server. The Meridian documentation, the Senate correspondence, data that until now only 2 people in the world had seen in full. He started making calls at 9. He finished at 2 in the morning. The invitation came from the Langford group 4 days later. Phrased as a courtesy, worded as a request, carrying the unmistakable undertone of people who had expected the other side to come back to the table with their hat in hand and were quietly recalibrating the fact that this hadn't happened. Aaron arrived at the same building, the same elevator, the same 42nd floor. But this time he walked past the receptionist without stopping, pushed open the conference room door without being announced, and sat down at the table. Not at the end where the guest chair had been positioned, but at the center of the near side, directly across from where Douglas Langford would sit. He was there for 6 minutes before anyone else came in. Helena entered first. She stopped when she saw him already seated. Something crossed her face, not quite surprise, but the small, involuntary shift of someone whose expectation has quietly broken. She sat down across from him without a word. The others filed in Douglas last. He took his seat. He looked at Aaron with the same studied composure he'd worn 4 days ago, in the same chair, in a room where he had been entirely in control. Something was different now, and both of them understood this without either of them saying so. Aaron reached into his bag and placed a single folder on the table. Thin, unbound, no logo. He slid it to the center. "You made an offer on a logistics optimization platform," he said. "That's not what you were actually looking at." He watched Douglas reach for the folder, watched Helena watch her father, watched the moment when the first page registered. The architecture diagrams, the government correspondence header, the performance data from Meridian's pilot. The room changed. "This has been running for how long?" Helena said. Her voice had taken on a careful quality that hadn't been present in any of their previous interactions. 18 months of development. 3 months of active pilot, Aaron said. "We've identified over 200 instances of bid irregularity across 14 federal procurement categories. 2 Senate offices are currently in conversation about a formal review process built around the system." He paused. "None of this exists in the entity the Langfords made an offer on." Douglas set the folder down slowly. His jaw moved slightly, but he said nothing. "You told me my moment was passing," Aaron said. He kept his voice level, not cold, not pointed, just honest. "I want you to understand something. The platform you made an offer for is 8 months behind what I actually built. You would have paid $1.2 billion for the version I was already finished with." The silence that settled over the room was nothing like the one 4 days ago. That one had been orchestrated. This one was searching for its footing. Helena closed the folder. She looked at Aaron directly, and for the first time her expression wasn't managing anything or measuring anything. It was simply paying attention. "What do you want?" she said. "To keep building what I started," Aaron said, "with partners who understand that what I bring to the table isn't just a product, it's a direction." He let that sit for a moment. "I'm open to conversations about the right structure, minority stake, advisory involvement, co-development on Meridian's next phase. I'm not open to handing over the keys and being given a plaque in return." Douglas leaned forward slightly, his elbows on the table, his hands clasped together. He looked at Aaron for a long moment, differently than before. Not like a man assessing a purchase, like a man reconsidering a miscalculation he'd been confident he hadn't made. "You kept this separate intentionally," Douglas said. "Not a question." "Yes," Aaron said. "Because you knew someone would make an offer. Because I wasn't ready to show it until I understood who I was showing it to." Another silence, longer this time. Then Douglas Langford exhaled, quietly, almost privately, and picked up the folder again. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be," he said. But the authority had drained out of the statement. It was an observation now, not a decree. "No," Aaron said. "I'm making it what it should have been from the beginning." Helena spoke next. She looked at him the way people look at a map they've been reading upside down and have just rotated. "We'll want our technical team to do a full review of Meridian's architecture," she said. "And we'll need to see the complete Senate documentation. That's a prerequisite to any further conversation." "I expect that," Aaron said. "I'll make myself available." She nodded once. Douglas said nothing more, but he set the folder down in front of himself instead of pushing it back across the table. In rooms like this one, the small movements meant everything. When the meeting ended, nothing had been signed and nothing had been promised. Aaron stood, collected his bag, and walked toward the door. Mr. Weston. He turned. Helena Langford was watching him, and in her expression, composed, everything still carefully managed. There was something new underneath the surface. The particular quality of a person who has revised their estimate of someone else and is choosing not to pretend otherwise. "We'll be in contact," she said, "on your terms this time." Aaron nodded once. He walked out. The season turned without fanfare. The Langford conversations continued, slower, more careful, with legal and technical back and forth that looked nothing like the original offer and everything like two parties genuinely trying to understand if they fit. Some weeks it seemed possible, some weeks it didn't. Aaron had learned, somewhere in the last 3 years of building something from nothing, that not every open door led somewhere and that this was fine. What mattered was being the one who decided which ones to walk through. Veripath stabilized. A new partnership came through in November, smaller than the Langford capital would have been, but clean and unencumbered. Kevin stopped sending terse messages at 11 at night. Priscilla started smiling at the Monday check-ins again. Nadia closed a state contract that Aaron hadn't even known she was pursuing, leading with Meridian's early data, which she'd asked him about quietly one afternoon and which he'd shared without hesitation because she had earned it. He still carried the drawing in his jacket pocket. He'd stopped noticing the weight of it, the way you stop noticing the weight of something that has simply become part of you. One evening in December, Clara found him at the kitchen table with a spread of papers she correctly identified as work stuff and sat down next to him anyway, spreading out her own school project. Something about ecosystems, with the absolute confidence of someone who had never questioned whether she was welcome in whatever room he happened to be in. They worked side by side for an hour without talking much. At some point, she looked over at his papers and said, "Is your company okay now?" He looked at her. "Yeah," he said, "it's okay." She went back to her drawing. After a moment, she said, without looking up, the same easy certainty she'd had about unicorns and Alaska and everything else she'd decided she understood. "I knew it would be. You always fix stuff." He watched her work, the careful way she was coloring in the ocean on her ecosystem diagram, her tongue slightly out, her attention absolute and undivided. He thought about what Douglas Langford had said. Men in your position tend to overestimate how much of their company's value is the company, and how much is simply their moment. He had been wrong about which moment mattered. Aaron Weston hadn't built Veripath to sell it when the timing was right. He'd built it because something in the world was broken, and he happened to be the person who knew how to fix it, and he had stayed in his seat in that boardroom twice, and he had refused to let someone else's definition of his value stand in for his own. Not because there was no cost to that refusal. There still was in certain ways on certain mornings. But the alternative was something that couldn't be expressed in a term sheet or a valuation or a title on a business card. It could be expressed in a folded piece of paper in his jacket pocket, worn soft at the creases, that said Dad's company. He builds it for us. And that had always been the only number that was never up for negotiation.